Millionaire disguises himself as homeless man to meet his in-laws and is horrified by how he's treated. James Edwards adjusted his tie in front of the full-length mirror in his luxurious Manhattan penthouse. At 32 years old, he was the very image of success. Tailored suit, designer watch, and a smile that hid years of insecurities. He gazed at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, remembering the days when he looked at those same buildings from the streets below, with an empty stomach and worn-out shoes. "Mr. Edwards, your car is ready," his assistant announced over the intercom. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be down in a moment," James replied, taking a final sip of his espresso. As he descended in the private elevator, his mind wandered to Sofia Rodriguez, his fiancée, beautiful, intelligent, and compassionate. Sofia was everything James had ever dreamed of. However, a persistent fear clouded his happiness. What if she, like so many others, was only interested in his money? The black Mercedes was waiting for him at the entrance. James slid into the back seat, greeting his driver with a nod. "Good morning, Frank. To the airport, please." As the car made its way through Manhattan's morning traffic, James closed his eyes, transporting himself back to his childhood in a run-down neighborhood of the city. Flashback 10-year-old James trembled in front of his class, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "James, did you bring the money for the field trip?" the teacher asked, extending her hand. With a shaky voice, James muttered, "No, I couldn't, miss." The laughter wasn't long in coming. "James, the poor boy," a child shouted from the back. "He can't even pay for a trip." Tears of shame rolled down his cheeks as he ran out of the classroom, vowing that someday no one would ever humiliate him for money again. End of flashback. James opened his eyes, finding himself back in the luxurious Mercedes. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the bitter memories. Today was an important day. He would be meeting Sofia's parents. Upon arriving at the airport, James headed to the VIP lounge. Sofia was waiting for him there, radiant as always. "James!" she exclaimed, running to embrace him. "Are you ready to meet my parents?" James forced a smile, hiding his anxiety. "Of course, honey, I can't wait." As they waited for the flight that would bring Sofia's parents, James couldn't help but think of all the times he had been judged for his money. Ex-girlfriends who had used him, friends who only appeared when they needed something. Would Sofia's parents be any different? Or would they see him as just a walking bank account? "Are you okay?" Sofia asked, noticing his unease. "You seem worried." James took her hand, trying to calm himself. "I'm fine, just a bit nervous. I want to make a good impression." Sofia smiled, kissing his cheek. "You will. My parents will love you. You'll see." But as the plane landed and the voice on the loudspeaker announced the arrival of the flight from Miami, James felt his heart racing. An idea began to form in his mind, a crazy idea that he couldn't ignore. "Sofia," he said suddenly, what if your parents didn't know who I really am?" Sofia looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" James swallowed hard, knowing that what he was about to propose could change everything. "What if they met me first as someone different, someone without money, without influence, just me?" Sofia's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and concern in her gaze. "James, what exactly are you suggesting?" Before James could respond, the doors opened and passengers began to exit. Among them, James saw a couple who could only be Sofia's parents. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the decision that would change the course of their lives. James observed as Sofia ran to hug her parents. Martha and David Rodriguez were the very image of a middle-class Hispanic-American couple, dressed simply but with dignity, their faces reflecting years of hard work and deep-rooted values. "Mom, Dad," exclaimed Sofia, melting into a family embrace that made James's heart ache with longing and fear. As Sofia introduced her parents, James maintained a cordial smile, but his mind was working at full speed. The idea that had emerged moments before was rapidly crystallizing into a plan. "It's a pleasure to meet you," said James, shaking hands with Martha and David. "Sofia has told me so much about you." David, a man with a serious expression and penetrating gaze, sized him up from head to toe. "So you're the famous James," he said in a tone that mixed curiosity and skepticism. Martha, on the other hand, offered him a warm smile. "We're delighted to finally meet you, James. Sophia never stops talking about you." As they left the airport, James excused himself for a moment, claiming an urgent work call. In reality, he needed a moment alone to set his plan in motion. In a secluded corner, he took out his phone and dialed a number. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me, and it's of utmost urgency and discretion." Minutes later, James rejoined Sophia and her parents in the parking lot. "I apologize for the delay," he said. "What do you say I treat you to dinner tonight? I know the perfect place." That night, in an elegant but not ostentatious restaurant, James observed the Rodriguez family interact. David, although cordial, maintained an evident emotional distance. Martha, on the other hand, was warm and curious, asking questions about James's life and his relationship with Sophia. "So, James," David began between bites, "Sophia tells us you're a businessman. What exactly do you do?" James felt that the moment had come. It was now or never. "Well, actually," he began, casting an apologetic look at Sophia, "I've been thinking a lot about that lately. You see, I've recently felt that I need a change in my life." Sophia looked at him in confusion. This wasn't the speech they had rehearsed. James continued, "I've decided to leave my job and, well, explore other options. I want to find something that really passionate me, even if it means starting from scratch." Silence fell over the table. David put down his fork, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. Martha looked at Sophia, who seemed as bewildered as they were. "James," Sophia finally said, her voice tense, "what are you talking about? You hadn't told me anything about this." "I know, and I'm sorry," James replied, taking her hand. "It's a recent decision. I want to be honest with all of you from the start." David cleared his throat. "Well, James, it's certainly a brave decision, but have you considered the implications? How do you plan to support my daughter?" "Dad!" exclaimed Sophia, embarrassed. No, it's okay," James intervened. "It's a valid question. The truth is, I don't have a concrete plan yet, but I'm willing to work hard, to start from the bottom if necessary." Martha, who had remained silent, spoke in a soft voice. "The important thing is that you're happy. Money comes and goes, but love and mutual support are what really matter." David didn't seem convinced, but nodded slowly. "I suppose you're right, dear. Although I must admit, this isn't what I expected to hear." The rest of the dinner passed in a tense atmosphere. Sophia alternated looks of confusion and annoyance towards James, who remained firm in his improvised story. As they said goodbye that night, James knew he had planted the seed of his plan. Now came the hardest part, convincing Sophia. Back in James's apartment, Sophia exploded. "What was all that?" she demanded. "Leaving your job, starting from scratch? James, have you gone crazy?" James took her hands, guiding her to the sofa. "Sophia, listen to me. It's not real." "What?" "It's a test," James explained. "I want to see how your parents react to someone without resources. Someone like I used to be." Sophia stared at him, mouth agape. "The test? James, why would you do something like that?" James took a deep breath, knowing it was time to reveal his deepest fears. "Because I'm afraid, Sophia. Afraid that your parents, like so many others, will only see my money. I want them to know me for who I am, not for what I have." Sophia stood up, pacing around the room. "This is madness, James. My parents aren't like that. I can't believe you distrust them. Distrust me." "I don't distrust you," James insisted. "It's just that my past, the experiences I've had, they've made me cautious." "And what about trust in our relationship?" Sophia asked, hurt. "Don't you think I deserved to know about this beforehand?" James lowered his gaze, ashamed. "You're right, I should have told you, but please understand me, I need to do this." Sophia looked at him for a long time, an evident conflict in her eyes. Finally, she sighed. "I don't agree with this, James. I think it's a mistake. But if you really feel you need to do it, I won't stop you." James stood up, embracing her. "Thank you, Sophia. I promise everything will turn out all right." As Sophia retreated to the bedroom, James remained alone in the living room, contemplating the night city through the window. He knew he was risking a lot, perhaps too much. But the need to know, to be sure, was stronger than the fear of losing everything. He took out his phone and sent a message to Sarah. "Start the operation tomorrow. I become someone else." Dawn found James in front of the mirror in his luxurious bathroom, observing his reflection with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Today was the day. His plan would be set in motion. The day he would transform into someone completely different. Sophia had already left, departing early to show her parents around the city. The tension between them was palpable, but James remained firm in his decision. The doorbell rang, announcing Sarah's arrival with the transformation team. James opened the door, finding his faithful assistant and a group of makeup and wardrobe professionals. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Sarah greeted, professional as always, despite the unusual situation. "Are you ready to begin?" James nodded, letting them in. "As ready as I can be." Over the next few hours, James underwent a complete metamorphosis. His perfectly styled hair was messed up and dyed a darker shade. A few days' stubble was expertly applied, giving him a disheveled but not unkempt appearance. Fake scars and blemishes completed the facial transformation. The wardrobe was equally meticulous. Designer suits were replaced with worn but clean clothes, faded jeans, a discolored t-shirt, and an old jacket. To complete the look, they gave him cheap-framed glasses and well-worn shoes. When he finally looked in the mirror, James barely recognized himself. In front of him stood a man who could well have been himself if life hadn't smiled upon him, if he had never escaped poverty. "It's perfect," he muttered, touching his transformed face. Sarah, observing from the side, asked cautiously, "Sir, are you sure you want to go through with this?" "We can still cancel everything." James turned to her, a new determination in his eyes. "No, Sarah, I need to do this. I need to know." With a sigh, Sarah nodded. "Very well. The apartment you requested is ready. It's small and in a modest neighborhood, but clean and safe. Here are the keys and the address." James took the keys, feeling their weight in his hand. It was the weight of a new life, even if temporary. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." "Just be careful, sir," said Sarah, the concern evident in her voice. "And remember, if you need anything at all, I'm just a call away." James nodded, grateful for his assistant's loyalty. He picked up a worn backpack containing some basic belongings and headed for the door. Before leaving, he stopped and looked one last time at the luxurious apartment that had been his home. For a moment, he hesitated. Was he really willing to leave everything behind, even temporarily? Was the risk worth it? The memory of the taunts from his childhood, of past betrayals, strengthened his resolve. Yes, it was worth it. He needed to know the truth. With a final sigh, James left the apartment, closing the door behind him. James Edwards, the millionaire, was left behind. Now he was just James, an ordinary man struggling to get by. The subway ride was a surreal experience. Accustomed to traveling in luxury cars, James found himself squeezed among the crowd, observing the tired faces of people struggling day to day. It was a world he had left behind long ago, but which now enveloped him again. He arrived at the small apartment in a modest but well-maintained building. It was a simple studio, a bed, a small kitchen, a bathroom. Nothing compared to his penthouse, but functional. This would be his home for the next few weeks. James sat on the bed, taking out his phone. He hesitated for a moment before dialing Sophia's number. "James?" Sophia's voice sounded worried. "Where are you? My parents have been asking about you." "I'm fine," James replied, trying to sound casual. "Listen, Sophia, I need you to go along with this. Tell your parents that we had an argument, that I left for a while to clear my head." There was a long silence on the line. When Sophia spoke again, her voice was full of sadness and frustration. "James, please reconsider this. It's not too late to turn back." "I'm sorry, Sophia, but I need to do this. I promise it will all make sense in the end." After hanging up, James lay back on the bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The plan was in motion. Tomorrow he would begin his new life as a man without resources, looking for work and struggling to survive. And most importantly, he would find a way to cross paths with Sophia's parents. As night fell over the city, James closed his eyes, mentally and emotionally, preparing himself for the challenges that awaited him. He didn't know if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or if he was about to discover a fundamental truth about love and acceptance. Only time would tell. The morning arrived with the strident sound of a cheap alarm, startling James from a restless sleep. For a moment, disoriented, he searched for the familiar luxury of his bedroom, only to find the bare walls and worn furniture of his new temporary home. He got up with a groan, stretching muscles sore from the hard mattress. The small bathroom and lukewarm rather than hot water vividly reminded him of the reality of his situation. As he dressed in worn but clean clothes, James mentally reviewed his plan for the day. He knew that Sophia's parents were staying at a hotel near Central Park. His goal was to find a way to cross paths with them, but in a way that seemed completely casual. He left the apartment, blending in with the morning crowd of workers. The aroma of cheap coffee and fresh bagels from a street stand made his stomach growl. With a sigh, James took out some coins from his pocket, carefully counting them before buying a coffee and a bagel. Every cent counted now. As he walked towards Central Park, James observed his surroundings with new eyes. The windows of luxury stores, which he used to barely notice, now seemed to mock him with their exorbitant prices. He realized how many things he had taken for granted in his previous life. He arrived at the park and sat on a bench, pretending to read the newspaper while discreetly scanning the passers-by. After an hour, he was about to give up when he saw them. Martha and David walking leisurely along one of the paths. James's heart raced. It was the moment of truth. He stood up, walking in their direction as if distracted, and at just the right moment, accidentally, bumped into David. "Oh, I'm so sorry," James exclaimed, feigning surprise and embarrassment. "I wasn't paying attention." David, taken by surprise, looked at him with a mixture of annoyance and confusion. "Watch where you're going, man," he grumbled. It was then that Martha recognized him. "Wait, David," she said, looking at James more closely. "Isn't this Sophia's boyfriend?" "James?" James feigned recognition, mixed with panic. "Oh my God, Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Rodriguez, how embarrassing. I didn't recognize you." David looked him up and down, his expression a mixture of surprise and something that seemed like disgust. "James? But what happened to you?" James lowered his gaze, feigning shame. I've fallen on hard times, Sophia and we had an argument. And well, things haven't been going well." Martha, her face full of concern, put a hand on his arm. "Oh dear, Sophia. Told us you had a fight. But she didn't mention this. Are you all right? Do you need help?" James felt a pang of guilt at Martha's genuine concern. "I'm surviving," he mumbled, "looking for work, trying to get my life in order." David, who had been observing in silence, finally spoke. "And what about your company, your money? Sophia told us you were a successful businessman." James swallowed hard, preparing for the biggest lie. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "Bad investments, trusting the wrong people in a matter of weeks. I lost it all." The silence that followed was deafening. James could see the shock on Martha and David's faces, mixed with something else, pity, contempt. He wasn't sure. Finally, Martha broke the silence. "James, come with us. Let us treat you to breakfast. We can talk. See how we can help you." James felt a lump in his throat. Martha's kindness was unexpected and touching. But before he could respond, David intervened. "Martha, I don't think that's a good idea. We don't know the whole story and we shouldn't get involved in Sophia's problems." "But David," Martha protested, "we can't just leave him like this." James, seeing the opportunity to observe the dynamics between Sophia's parents more closely, decided to take Martha's offer. "I really appreciate it," he said with a broken voice. "A coffee would be nice if it's not too much trouble." David sighed, clearly uncomfortable but yielding to his wife's insistence. "All right then, let's go." As they walked to a nearby cafe, James couldn't help but notice the sidelong glances David was throwing him, a mixture of suspicion and something that seemed almost satisfaction. On the other hand, Martha treated him with a kindness that made him feel even more guilty about his deception. Seated in the cafe with steaming cups of coffee in front of them, James prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be an intense and revealing conversation. What he didn't know was that this encounter would set in motion a series of events that would test not only his plan, but also his relationship with Sophia and his own understanding of himself. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air of the small cafe. James, seated across from Sophia's parents, felt like an imposter. The guilt over his deception fought against his determination to get to the bottom of their true feelings. Martha broke the uncomfortable silence. "James, tell us what exactly happened. The last time we saw you, you seemed, well, very different." James lowered his gaze to his coffee cup, gathering courage for his elaborate lie. "Everything fell apart so quickly," he began, his voice tinged with false shame. "I invested in a business that seemed promising. I put everything I had into it. But it turned out to be a scam." David, who had been observing James, with a mixture of skepticism and something that seemed almost like satisfaction, intervened. "And you didn't realize before? An experienced businessman like you." "David," Martha warned, shooting a reproachful look at her husband. James shook his head. "I should have seen it coming. I was arrogant. I thought I knew everything." Martha extended her hand, gently touching James's arm. "The important thing is that you're okay. Have you talked to Sophia about this?" The mention of Sophia made James visibly tense. "No, I haven't had the courage. She deserves better than this." He gestured towards himself, embodying the image of a defeated man. David leaned forward, his gaze intense. "So what? You just left her without explanation?" James felt a pang of real guilt. In his eagerness to test Sophia's parents, wasn't he doing exactly what he feared? Judging without knowing the whole story. "I thought it was for the best," he mumbled. "She has a bright future ahead of her. I didn't want to be a burden." Martha shook her head, a mixture of compassion and disapproval on her face. "Oh, James, that's not the kind of decision you should make alone. Sophia loves you. I'm sure she would want to be by your side in difficult times." David, however, seemed less convinced. "Maybe James is right," he said, earning a surprised look from his wife. "If he can't provide a stable life for Sophia, perhaps it's better if he stays away." David's words hit James like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly the kind of reaction he feared, but hearing it out loud was much more painful than he expected. "David, how can you say that?" Martha exclaimed, clearly upset. "A person's worth isn't measured by their bank account. It's not just about money, Martha," David replied, his tone defensive. "It's about responsibility, planning for the future. If James could lose everything so easily, what guarantee do we have that it won't happen again?" James observed the exchange with a mixture of fascination and horror. He was getting exactly what he wanted, an unfiltered view of how Sophia's parents really saw him, but the emotional cost was much higher than he had anticipated. I'm sorry," James interrupted, his voice breaking. "I never meant to cause problems between you. Maybe I should go." Martha stopped him with a gesture. "No, James, stay. We need to sort this out." She turned to her husband. "David, you're being unfair. We all make mistakes. What's important is how we pick ourselves up afterward." David sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I just want what's best for Sophia. It's always been that way." "I know," Martha said, softly, "but don't you think Sophia should have a say in this? It's her life, her relationship." James, listening to this conversation, felt increasingly guilty. He had started all this to test Sophia's parents, but in the process, he was discovering more about himself than about them. "You're right," he finally said. "I've been a coward. I should talk to Sophia, explain everything." Martha smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's the right attitude, James, and if you need help, anything at all, we're here." David, although still reluctant, nodded slowly. "I suppose we all deserve a second chance, but James, if you're going to be with our daughter, you need to prove that you're worthy of her." David's words resonated in James's mind. Worthy of her. Was he really? Didn't this whole farce prove precisely the opposite? I'll do everything I can to prove my worth," James said, his voice mixing real guilt with his act. Sophia deserves it. Martha smiled approvingly, while David maintained a cautious but less hostile expression than before. "Good," said Martha, finishing her coffee. "Now, James, where are you staying? Do you need a place?" James felt panic for a moment. He hadn't considered that they might offer direct help. "Oh no, don't worry, I have a small apartment. It's modest, but enough for now." David raised an eyebrow. "And work? Have you been looking?" "Yes, every day," James lied. "It's difficult, but I'm not giving up." Martha exchanged a look with her husband before turning to James. "Look, we're here for a few more weeks. Why don't you come to dinner with us tomorrow? We can talk more, see how we can help you." James found himself nodding before he could think it through. "Thank you, you're very kind," as they said goodbye. Outside the cafe, James felt a mixture of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was getting exactly what he wanted, a close view of Sophia's parents' true thoughts and feelings. On the other hand, the guilt over his deception grew with each act of kindness from Martha and each skeptical look from David. Back in his small apartment, James collapsed on the bed, emotionally and physically exhausted. He took out his phone, hesitating before dialing Sophia's number. "James?" Sophia's voice sounded worried. "Where have you been? My parents called. They said they found you in the park. What's going on?" James closed his eyes, guilt crushing him. "Sophia, I'm sorry. Things got more complicated than I expected." "James, please," Sophia pleaded, "stop this madness. Come home. We can talk to my parents together, explain everything." For a moment, James was tempted to give in, to confess everything and return to his normal life. But the memory of David's look, that mixture of contempt and satisfaction at seeing him fallen, strengthened his resolve. "I can't, Sophia. Not yet. I need to see this through to the end." There was a long silence on the line when Sophia spoke again. Her voice was full of sadness and frustration. "James, I love you, but I don't know how much longer I can go on with this. You're hurting everyone, including yourself." Sophia's words were like a dagger to James's heart. "I know," he said quietly. "I promise it will all make sense soon. Just trust me a little longer." After hanging up, James stared at the ceiling, doubts consuming him. Was it worth risking his relationship with Sophia for this test? What if he ended up discovering something he didn't want to know? With these turbulent thoughts, James prepared for the next day's dinner, knowing it would be an even greater test for his plan and for himself. The day of the dinner arrived faster than James expected. He found himself in front of the mirror of his modest apartment, adjusting his worn clothes and making sure his impoverished appearance was convincing. Every detail mattered, from the poorly shaved beard to the strategically placed stains on his shirt. As he headed to the hotel where Sophia's parents were staying, James mentally rehearsed his story. Each lie, each fabricated detail weighed on him, but he reminded himself why he was doing it. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He arrived at the hotel, an elegant establishment that strongly contrasted with his current appearance. In the lobby, he noticed the suspicious glances from some guests and staff. It was a stark reminder of how the world treated people differently based on their appearance. Martha greeted him at the door of their suite with a warm smile. "James, I'm glad you came. Please, come in." The interior of the suite was luxurious, reminding James of the life he had temporarily left behind. David was sitting in an armchair reading the newspaper. He looked up when James entered, his expression a mixture of forced courtesy and barely disguised skepticism. "Good evening, James," David greeted, standing to shake his hand. James noticed how David subtly wiped his hand on his pants after the handshake. Dinner was served at a small table on the terrace overlooking the city. James sat down, feeling uncomfortable under David's scrutinizing gaze. "So, James," David began as Martha served the food, "have you had any luck looking for work?" James lowered his gaze to his plate. "I've been looking, but it's difficult. Many places want recent experience, references." Martha intervened sympathetically. "It must be frustrating, but don't give up. I'm sure something will come up soon." David, however, seemed less convinced. "And have you considered simpler jobs? Maybe something temporary just to keep you afloat?" James felt a twinge of irritation at David's condescending tone, but forced himself to stay calm. Yes, I've thought about that. In fact, tomorrow I have an interview for a cleaning job at a restaurant. The lie came out of his lips before he could think it through. He saw David's eyes light up, with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed almost like satisfaction. Well, that's a start, David said, his tone oscillating between approval and pity. Martha, noticing the tension, tried to change the subject. James, have you talked to Sophia lately? She's very worried about you. Guilt hit James hard. I talked to her briefly. I told her I needed time to sort out my thoughts. David put down his fork with a soft but audible thud. Time? James, do you realize how unfair that is to Sophia? She deserves clarity, not a boyfriend who disappears when things get tough. David, Martha warned, but he continued. No, Martha, someone has to say it, James. When we met Sophia, she told us you were a successful, responsible man, someone she could trust. Where is that man now? David's words hit James like a punch to the stomach. Part of him wanted to scream the truth, to reveal the whole deception. But another part, the part that was still seeking answers, kept him in his role. I'm sorry, James mumbled. You're right. I've been a coward. Sophia deserves better. Martha put a hand over James's. Don't say that. We all make mistakes. What's important is how we face them. David sighed, rubbing his forehead. Look, James, I'll be frank with you. When Sophia told us about you, we were excited. We thought she had finally found someone who could give her the life she deserves. Now I'm not so sure. David! Martha exclaimed, horrified. But David continued, No, Martha, he needs to hear this. James, if you really love Sophia, you have to prove that you're worthy of her, not just with words, but with actions. Show us that you can overcome this, that you can be the man she needs. James felt his heart sink. Here it was, the truth he so feared to hear. David saw him as unworthy, as someone who didn't deserve Sophia without his wealth and status. James began, his voice breaking. I'll do everything I can for Sophia. The rest of the dinner passed in an uncomfortable silence, interrupted only by Martha's attempts to lighten the mood. When he finally said goodbye, James felt emotionally drained. Back in his small apartment, James collapsed on the bed, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had gotten the answers he was looking for, but at a much greater emotional cost than he expected. He took out his phone, looking at Sophia's picture on the screen. Was all this worth it? Was he really protecting their relationship, or destroying it with his own hands? With a shaky sigh, James made a decision. Tomorrow he would face the consequences of his actions, whatever the outcome. The next morning found James awake long before dawn, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Last night's dinner had been revealing, but not in the way he had expected. Instead of gaining clarity, he felt more confused than ever. He got up from the uncomfortable bed, moving to the small window of his temporary apartment. The city was still asleep, the empty streets illuminated by the dim light of the street lamps. James wondered how many people out there were truly struggling to survive while he played at being poor. With a heavy sigh, he took out his phone. He had several missed calls from Sophia and a voicemail. With his heart racing, he played it. James. Sophia's voice sounded tired and worried. I don't know what's going on, but please come back. My parents are worried. I'm worried. I love you, and whatever you're going through, we can face it together. Please call me. Guilt hit him hard. What was he doing? In his eagerness to test Sophia's parents, he was hurting the person who mattered most to him. Determined, James began to dress. It was time to face the truth, to confess everything and accept the consequences. But just as he was about to leave, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello, he answered cautiously. James Edwards, asked a male voice. This is Mike, the manager of The Grill told you were looking for work. James froze. He remembered the lie he had told at dinner about a job interview. Yes, he responded, his mind working at full speed. I'm interested in any opportunity. Good, said Mike. We need someone for cleaning and general help. Can you come in today for a trial? James hesitated. Part of him wanted to reject the offer, to end this whole farce, but another part, the part that was still seeking answers, prompted him to accept. "Sure," he heard himself say, "I'll be there." After hanging up, James sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. What was he doing? Each lie led him deeper into this well of deception, but something inside him told him he needed to see this through to the end. With one last glance at Sophia's photo on his phone, James left the apartment, heading towards a new phase of his plan, a phase that not even he had anticipated. The Grill was a modest but clean establishment in the heart of the city. James entered, feeling out of place even with his unkempt appearance. Mike, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, greeted him with an evaluating look. "James? Good. Let's get started. I need to see how you work." The next few hours were a physical and emotional test for James. He cleaned floors, washed dishes, took out the trash tasks he had never performed before, at least not since his childhood. Every muscle in his body protested, and his hands, accustomed to keyboards and documents, were now red and cracked from hard work and cleaning products. As he worked, James couldn't help but reflect on his situation. Here he was, a millionaire, pretending to be a man desperate for work, performing tasks that many did daily without complaint. The irony wasn't lost on him. At the end of the day, Mike called him to his office. "Well, James, it's not the best work I've seen, but you put in effort. The job is yours if you want it." James found himself nodding before he could think it through. "Thank you, I really appreciate it." He left the restaurant feeling exhausted but strangely satisfied. There was something about hard work, about earning a living with his own hands, that resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. As he walked back to his temporary apartment, James stopped in his tracks a few meters away. He saw Sophia walking with her parents. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't prepared for this encounter, not like this, not now. Quickly, he hid in the doorway of a nearby store, observing the scene unfolding. Before him, Sophia looked tired. Worried Martha had her arm around her shoulders, consoling her, while David spoke with energetic gestures. James strained his ears, trying to catch fragments of their conversation. "Can't go on like this, honey," David was saying. "If James doesn't show up soon, we'll have to take action." "Your father is right, sweetie," Martha added. "We're worried about you." Sophia shook her head. "You don't understand, I know James. He must have a good reason for all this." Sophia's unwavering faith in him was like a punch to the gut for James. Here she was, defending him, believing in him, while he was deceiving her with this elaborate farce. When the trio moved away, James came out of his hiding place feeling guiltier than ever. He arrived at his apartment in a state of emotional confusion. He sat on the bed, his head in his hands. What was he doing? He had started all this to test Sophia's parents, but in the process he was testing his own relationship, his own integrity. He took out his phone, looking at Sophia's picture on the screen. Her eyes, normally full of joy, now looked at him with a mixture of love and concern. James felt, his heart breaking. With trembling hands, he dialed Sophia's number. It rang once, twice. "James." Sophia's voice was a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Where are you? Are you okay?" James took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth. "Sophia, I need to see you. We need to talk." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Sophia spoke again, her voice was full of contained emotion. "Okay, where?" "In Central Park, by the pond, in an hour." "I'll be there," Sophia said, before hanging up. James stared at the phone for a long moment. Then, with determination, he stood up. It was time to face the consequences of his actions. He looked in the mirror, seeing the tired and bearded face that stared back at him. Should he remove the disguise? Present himself to Sophia as the James she knew? After a moment of doubt, he decided not to. He needed Sophia to see him like this, to fully understand what he had been doing. He left the apartment with a heavy heart, but a clear purpose. As he walked towards the park, he went over in his mind what he was going to say, how he was going to explain his actions. Central Park was quiet at that time of the afternoon. James arrived at the pond before Sophia and sat on a bench, watching the ducks swim lazily in the water. "James?" He turned at the sound of Sophia's voice. There she was, beautiful as always, but with dark circles under her eyes that betrayed nights of insomnia and worry. "Sophia," he said, standing up. She looked him up and down, her eyes widening in surprise at his unkempt appearance. "James, what's happened to you?" James took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth. "Sophia, sit down. Please, I have something to confess to you." The sun of the afternoon bathed Central Park in a golden light, creating an ironic contrast with the dark conversation that was about to unfold. James and Sophia sat on the bench, facing the pond, a visible space between them that seemed to symbolize the emotional distance James had created with his actions. "Sophia," James began, his voice trembling slightly. "First of all, I want you to know that I love you. Everything I've done, as wrong as it may have been, I did, thinking about our future." Sophia looked at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. "James, you're scaring me. What's going on? Why do you look like this?" James took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the truth. "All of this," he said, gesturing towards his unkempt appearance, "is a disguise, a farce I created to test your parents." Sophia's eyes widened, disbelief painted on her face. "What? James, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" "Ever since I was a child," James continued, his voice laden with emotion, "I've been judged by my economic situation. First for being poor, then for being rich. When I met your parents, I was afraid that they would judge me only for my money, that they would think I wasn't worthy of you." Sophia listened in silence, her expression changing from confusion to pain. "So I devised this plan," James went on. "I disguised myself as a man who had lost everything. I wanted to see how your parents would react, how they would treat me if I had nothing to offer you." "Oh, James," Sophia sighed, her voice mixing disappointment and sadness. "How could you?" I know, James said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "It was crazy, a stupid idea. But at the time, it seemed like the only way to know the truth." "And what truth did you discover?" Sophia asked, her tone now tinged with bitterness. "Was it worth all this?" James lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I discovered that your parents are complex. Your mother, Martha, showed compassion and kindness, even when she thought I had nothing but your father, David." "What about my father?" Sophia pressed. He didn't hide his disappointment. He made it clear that he thought I was no longer worthy of you," James admitted. Sophia suddenly stood up, taking a few steps away before turning back to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And it didn't occur to you to think about me and all this? About how it would affect me?" Guilt hit James hard. "Sophia, I'm so sorry. I was so focused on my own fears and insecurities that I didn't realize the harm I was causing." "You lied to me, James," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "Not just to me, but to my parents. You played with everyone's feelings." James stood up, trying to approach her, but Sophia stepped back. "I know, and I have no excuse. I was wrong, terribly wrong." "And what about the job?" Sophia asked. "Was that a lie too?" James shook his head. "No, that was real. I got a cleaning job at a restaurant. It was part of the farce at first, but it felt real." Sophia looked at him for a long time, as if she was seeing a stranger. "I don't know who you are now, James. The man I fell in love with would never have done something like this." Those words were like a knife to James's heart. "Sophia, please, I know I made a terrible mistake, but I'm still me, the man who loves you more than anything in the world." "Love is based on trust, James," Sophia said, her voice firm despite the tears that now flowed freely down her cheeks. "And you've broken that trust." James took a step forward, desperate. "Tell me what I can do to fix it. I'll do anything, Sophia, anything." Sophia looked at him, a mixture of love and pain in her eyes. "I need time, James. Time to process all of this, to think about what it means for us." "I understand," James said, his heart sinking. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting." Sophia nodded slowly. And I need you to talk to my parents, to tell them the truth. You owe them that." James swallowed hard, knowing that facing Sophia's parents would be one of the hardest things he would have to do. But he nodded. "I will, I promise you." Sophia looked at him one last time, a look that contained all the love and pain she felt. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked away, leaving James alone by the pond. James collapsed on the bench, watching as the love of his life walked away, possibly forever. The consequences of his actions hit him with full force. He had sought the truth, but in the process, he had risked the most valuable thing he had. As the sun set over Central Park, James sat there, contemplating the water in the pond, wondering if he could ever repair the damage he had caused. The days following the confession were a whirlwind of emotions for James. He moved through the city like an automaton, dividing his time between his small temporary apartment and work at the restaurant. Each night he looked at his phone, waiting for a message from Sophia that never came a week after their encounter in the park. James received a message that made his heart stop for a moment. "My parents want to see you tomorrow, 7 p.m. at their hotel suite. It's time for you to tell them the truth." James spent the night wide awake, mentally and emotionally preparing himself for what he knew would be a difficult confrontation. The next morning, he looked at himself in the mirror. Should he go as Millionaire James or maintain his disguise as a down-on-his-luck man? Finally, he opted for a middle ground. He shaved off the unkempt beard and dressed in clean but simple clothes. It was time to show himself as he truly was, without pretensions. At 7 p.m. sharp, James was standing in front of the suite door. He took a deep breath and knocked. Martha opened the door, her expression a mixture of surprise and relief at seeing him more put together. "James, please come in." The atmosphere inside the suite was tense. David was standing by the window, his posture rigid. Sophia was sitting on the couch, her face a mask of contained emotions. "Sit down, James," David said, his voice cold. James took a seat, feeling the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on him. "Well," David began, "Sophia told us you had something important to tell us. We're listening." James looked at each of them, gathering courage. Finally, he fixed his gaze on Sophia, seeking strength in her eyes. "First of all," he began, "I want to ask for your forgiveness. What I did was inexcusable, and I'm here to take responsibility for my actions." David narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" James took a deep breath. "All of this, my supposed fall from grace, was a farce, a plan I devised to test you." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha brought a hand to her mouth, horrified. David, for his part, seemed to be struggling to contain his anger. "You deceived us," Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper. James nodded, shame evident on his face. "Yes, I pretended to have lost everything, to see how you would react, how you would treat me if I wasn't the millionaire you initially met." David exploded. "How dare you? You played with our emotions, with our trust, for a whim." "It wasn't a whim," James tried to explain. "All my life I've been judged by my economic situation. I wanted to know if you would accept me for who I am, not for what I have." "And that justifies lying?" Martha intervened, her tone mixing disappointment and sadness. "James, we opened our hearts to you. We tried to help you." James lowered his gaze, guilt crushing him. "I know, and I have no words to express how sorry I am. Your kindness only made me feel worse about all this." David approached, his face red with anger. "And what did you expect to discover? That we're horrible people who only care about money?" "No, James faltered, realizing how absurd it all sounded. "I guess I was afraid of not being accepted for who I really am." Sophia, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but firm. "James, do you realize that by doing this, you demonstrated exactly what you feared? You judged my parents before giving them a chance to really know you." Sophia's words hit James like a punch to the stomach. She was right. In his eagerness not to be judged, he had been the one to judge first. "You're right," James admitted, his voice breaking. I was so focused on my own fears that I didn't realize I was doing exactly what I feared from others. David, still visibly upset, sat heavily in an armchair. And what about the restaurant job? Was that part of your experiment too? James shook his head. No, that was real. I got that job as part of my charade, but it was a revealing experience. It made me realize many things about myself and about the value of hard work. Martha, who had been listening attentively, intervened. James, I understand that your past experiences have left scars, but didn't it occur to you that you could have given us the benefit of the doubt, that you could have gotten to know us genuinely before judging us? Martha's words were full of a wisdom that made James feel even more ashamed. You're right, Mrs. Rodriguez. My fear blinded me. I owe all of you an apology. He turned to Sophia, his eyes full of regret. Especially you, Sophia. I betrayed your trust. I made you suffer unnecessarily. I'm so sorry. Sophia looked at him, her eyes a mixture of pain and love. James, I love you, but this has shaken the foundations of our relationship. I need to know if I can trust you again. David stood up, his initial anger giving way to deep disappointment. James, when we met you, we thought you were a man of integrity, someone worthy of our daughter. Now I don't know what to think. James nodded, accepting the weight of his words. I understand, Mr. Rodriguez. I know I've broken your trust, and that of your entire family. I can only ask for the opportunity to prove that I can be better, that I can learn from my mistakes. Martha, always the voice of reason, spoke. James, what you did was deeply hurtful and wrong. But I also see a man who is genuinely remorseful and willing to face the consequences of his actions. That says something about your character. James looked at Martha gratefully, surprised by her ability to see beyond his mistakes. David, however, wasn't so willing to forgive. You may be remorseful, James, but actions have consequences. You've broken this family's trust, and trust, once broken, is very difficult to repair. Sophia stood up, approaching James. I need time, James. Time to process all of this, to see if I can trust you again. And I think you also need time to work on yourself, to understand why you did what you did. James nodded, feeling tears threatening to escape his eyes. I understand. I'll take that time, Sophia. I'll work on myself. On my insecurities, I'll prove to you that I can be the man you deserve. He stood up, looking at each member of the Rodriguez family. To all of you, I'll prove that I can be better, that this mistake doesn't define me. David spoke, his voice laden with contained emotion. We'll see, James. Words are easy. It's actions that count. James nodded, accepting the implicit challenge in David's words. He headed towards the door, but before leaving, he turned one last time. Thank you for listening. To me, I know I don't deserve it, but I appreciate the opportunity to explain myself. I'll do everything I can to earn back your trust and respect. With those words, James left the suite, leaving behind a shocked family and a relationship in limbo. As he descended in the elevator, he felt the weight of his actions, but also a spark of determination. He had made a terrible mistake, but he was determined to learn from it, to grow and to prove that he was worthy of Sophia's love and her family's respect. The path to redemption would be long and difficult, but James was willing to walk it, step by step, day by day. The weeks following the confrontation were a period of deep introspection and change for James. He decided to keep his job, at the grill, not as part of a charade, but as a constant reminder of humility and the value of hard work. Every morning, James woke up before dawn, headed to the restaurant, and immersed himself in demanding physical work. He scrubbed floors, washed dishes, and performed all the tasks he once considered beneath him. The honest hard work provided him with a mental clarity he had never experienced before. Mike, the restaurant manager, noticed the change in James. You've improved a lot, he told him one day. There's a determination in you that I didn't see at first. James smiled weakly. Let's just say I'm learning important lessons. Meanwhile, James began seeking professional help to address his insecurity and trust issues. He found a therapist, Dr. Martinez, and started weekly sessions. James, Dr. Martinez said in one of their sessions, What you did was an extreme defense mechanism. We need to explore where this fear of rejection comes from and how you can build relationships based on trust and authenticity. James nodded, accepting the challenge. I'm willing to do the work, Doctor. I need to be better for Sophia, for her family, but most of all for myself. Outside of therapy and work, James began to get involved in volunteer activities. He collaborated at a soup kitchen, taught basic business skills at a community center, and donated a large portion of his fortune to charitable causes. All anonymously. He wasn't seeking recognition. He was looking for a way to give back to the community and connect with people in a genuine way. Despite his desire to contact Sophia, he respected her request for space. However, one night after a long day of work, James couldn't resist and sent her a message. Sophia, I know you asked for time and space, and I respect that. I just wanted you to know that I'm working hard to be a better version of myself. I love you, and I hope that someday you can forgive me. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. He didn't expect a response, but to his surprise, his phone vibrated a few minutes later. Thank you for respecting my space, James. I'm glad to know you're working on yourself. I've been reflecting a lot too. Maybe we could meet soon to talk. James's heart skipped a beat. It was a small hope, but it was more than he dared to expect. Meanwhile, Sophia's life had also been a whirlwind of emotions. She spent long hours talking with her parents, processing what had happened and trying to understand her own feelings. I don't know what to do, Mom, Sophia confessed one night. I love James, but how can I trust him after what he did? Martha hugged her daughter. Love is complicated. My dear, James made a serious mistake, but I also see a man willing to change, to face his demons. The question is, are you willing to give him another chance? David, who had been listening in silence, intervened. Sophia, you know I only want the best for you. James hurt us all with his actions, but I must admit that his willingness to take responsibility and work on himself says a lot about his character. Sophia looked at her father, surprised by his words. Dad, I thought you hated him for what he did. David sighed. I was angry, and I still am to some degree. But I also understand the fear that led him to act that way. I don't justify it, but I understand it. These conversations led Sophia to make a decision. It was time to talk to James face to face. They agreed to meet on the same bench in Central Park, where James had confessed the truth weeks earlier. When Sophia arrived, she found James already seated, dressed in simple work clothes, very different from the businessman he used to be. Hello, James, Sophia said softly, sitting down beside him. James looked at her, his eyes full of love and remorse. Hello, Sophia. Thank you for coming. There was a moment of silence, the weight of all that was unsaid between them. You look different, Sophia commented. James smiled weakly. I feel different. These weeks have been revealing. Tell me, said Sophia, genuinely interested. And so, James began to talk. He told her about his work at the restaurant, his therapy sessions, his volunteer work. He spoke of the lessons he was learning, of how he was facing his fears and insecurities. Sophia listened attentively, seeing the sincerity in James's eyes, noticing the calluses on his hands, witnesses to his hard work. James, she finally said, what you did hurt us deeply. Me, my parents. You broke our trust. James nodded, accepting her words. I know, Sophia, and I'm sorrier than I can express. But, Sophia continued, I also see that you're making a genuine effort to change, to be better. That means a lot to me. James looked at her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Do you think you can ever forgive me? That we could try again? Sophia took his hand, the first physical contact they had had in weeks. Forgiveness is a process, James. It won't happen overnight. But I'm willing to try, to rebuild our relationship, step by step. Sophia's words filled James with a mixture of relief and determination. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that they would have to work hard to rebuild trust, but he was willing to do whatever it took. Thank you, Sophia, he said, his voice full of emotion. I Promise I won't waste this opportunity. I'll be the man you deserve, the man I know I can be." As the sun set over Central Park, James and Sophia remained seated, talking, sometimes laughing, other times crying. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship, one based on honesty, vulnerability, and mutual growth. James's path to redemption was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. With Sophia by his side, he was ready to face any challenge that came, to grow and to love in a deeper and more authentic way than ever. Before, the following months were a period of growth and reconstruction for James and Sophia. Their relationship, though still fragile, began to strengthen day by day. James continued with his work at the restaurant and his therapy sessions, while Sophia supported him, but also maintained her own boundaries. One afternoon, as James was cleaning tables after the lunch shift, he received an unexpected visit. David Rodriguez entered the restaurant, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Rodriguez," said James, surprised, "I didn't expect to see you here." David looked around, noting James's stained apron and his hands rough from work. "I didn't expect to come, to be honest, but Sophia insisted I should see for myself all of this." James nodded, understanding. "Would you like to sit down? I can bring you a coffee." As James prepared the coffee, his mind was racing. What did David want? Was this an opportunity to repair the damage he had caused? He sat down across from David, who took a sip of coffee before speaking. "James, what you did, it hurt us deeply, especially Sophia." "I know," James responded, the guilt evident in his voice, "and I regret it more than I can express." David looked at him intently. "However, Sophia has told us about the changes you've been making, about your work here, your therapy, your volunteering." James nodded. "I'm trying to be better, Mr. Rodriguez, to face my fears and insecurities in a healthy way." "And this job?" David asked, gesturing towards the restaurant. "Why are you still here? You have a company to run, don't you?" James took a deep breath before responding. "It's true, I still have my company, but this job, it's taught me a lot about humility, about the value of hard work, about ordinary people who struggle every day to get ahead. I don't want to lose that perspective." David observed him in silence for a moment, as if evaluating him. "You know, when you were the successful businessman, I thought you were perfect for Sophia. When I believed you had lost everything, I worried about her future. And now I don't know what to think." James leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand your confusion. I myself have been through an emotional whirlwind these past months. But if I've learned anything, it's that money and success don't define a person. What matters is how we treat others, how we face our mistakes, how we grow." David nodded slowly. "Wise words, James. But words are easy. It's actions that count." "I know," James replied, "and I'm willing to prove with my actions that I've changed, that I'm worthy of Sophia and your family's respect." At that moment, Mike, the restaurant manager, approached the table. "James, your shift ended half an hour ago. You should go home." James smiled. "Thanks. Mike, I was just having an important conversation with my girlfriend's father." Mike looked at David and then at James. "Ah, I see. Well, I just wanted to tell you that I appreciate your extra work. You're one of my best employees, although I suspect you won't be here forever." When Mike walked away, David looked at James curiously. "It seems you've earned your boss's respect." James shrugged. "I just try to do my job as best I can." David was silent for a moment, as if considering something. Finally, he spoke. "James, I can't say I've completely forgiven you. What you did was difficult to accept. But I see that you're making a genuine effort to change, to be better, that means something." James felt a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. That means a lot to me." David stood up, preparing to leave. "Martha and I are organizing a family dinner. This weekend, Sophia will be there. Of course, we'd like you to come too." James looked at him, surprised. I'd be honored, Mr. Rodriguez." "Thank you." As David headed for the door, he stopped and turned. "And James, you can call me David." With those words, he left the restaurant, leaving James with a mixture of emotions. It was a small step, but a significant one, a bridge that was beginning to be rebuilt. That night, James called Sophia to tell her about her father's visit. "My dad went to see you at the restaurant?" Sophia asked, surprised. "Yes," James replied. "It was intense, but I think it was good. He invited me to the family dinner this weekend." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. When Sophia spoke again, her voice was full of emotion. "Oh, James, that's wonderful. You know, I've been talking a lot with my parents about you. About us. I think they're starting to see how much you've changed." James felt his eyes fill with tears. "Sophia, I don't know what to say. No, we still have a long way to go. But knowing that you and your family are willing to give me another chance, it means everything to me." "I love you, James," Sophia said softly. "And I'm proud of you, of how you've faced your mistakes, of how you're working to be better." "I love you too, Sophia," James responded, "and I promise I'll keep striving every day to be worthy of your love and trust." As he hung up the phone, James felt overwhelmed by gratitude and hope. The path to redemption was long and sometimes difficult, but with each small step he felt he was getting closer to being the best version of himself. He went to bed that night with a smile on his face, eager for the weekend and the opportunity to continue rebuilding the bridges that his deception had damaged. He knew the family dinner would be another challenge, another test, but this time he was ready to face it with honesty and humility. The day of the family dinner arrived faster than James expected. He found himself in front of the mirror of his modest apartment, nervously adjusting his shirt. He had decided to dress simply but elegantly, a reflection of the new perspective he had gained in recent months before leaving. James paused for a moment to reflect on his journey, from the insecure millionaire who had planned an elaborate deception to the man who now strived to be authentic and honest in every aspect of his life. The path had been difficult, but each step had brought him closer to the person he truly wanted to be. He arrived at the Rodriguez's house with a bouquet of flowers for Martha and a bottle of wine for David. Sophia was waiting for him at the door, her warm smile calming some of his nervousness. "You look beautiful," James told her, softly kissing. Her cheek Sophia took his hand. "And you look at peace," she replied, noticing the calmness in his eyes that had replaced the previous restlessness. They entered the house together, where Martha and David were waiting. The atmosphere was tense at first, but James was determined to face it with grace and honesty. "Thank you for inviting me," he said, handing over the gifts. "It means a lot to me to be here with all of you." Martha hugged him warmly. "We're glad you came, James." David, although more reserved, gave him a firm handshake. "Welcome, James." The dinner went surprisingly well. The conversation flowed more easily than any of them expected. James shared stories about his work at the restaurant, the lessons he had learned, how he was managing his company in a more ethical and conscious way. "You know," David said at one point, "when you deceived us, I thought you were a man without principles. But seeing how you've handled all this, how you've worked to be better, well, I think I was wrong." James felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, David. I made a terrible mistake, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to make amends." Martha smiled, taking her husband's hand. "We all make mistakes, James. What's important is how we face them and how we grow from them." Sophia, who had been observing the exchange with bright eyes, spoke. "I'm so proud of all of you, of how we've been able to overcome this together." After dinner, while Martha and David cleaned up in the kitchen, James and Sophia went out to the garden. The night was warm and the sky was full of stars. "Sophia," James said, taking her hands, "these last few months have been the most difficult, but also the most transformative of my life. I've learned so much about myself, about what really matters in life." Sophia looked at him with love. "I know, James, I've seen your change, your growth. It's one of the reasons why I love you even more now." James took a deep breath, gathering courage for what he was about to do. "Sophia, when I started all this, I was full of fear and insecurity. I was afraid of not being good enough for you, for your family. Now I know that a person's worth isn't in their bank, account, or social status, but in their character, in how they treat others, in how they face adversity." He knelt down, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Sophia Rodriguez, I love you with all my heart. Would you do me the honor of marrying me? Not as the millionaire I was, but as the man I am now, the man you've helped me become." Sophia gasped, tears of happiness forming in her eyes. "Oh, James, yes, yes, I'll marry you." As they embraced, Martha and David appeared at the garden door, drawn by the commotion. Seeing the scene, they both smiled. "Well," David said, his voice laden with emotion, "it looks like we have something else to celebrate." Martha ran to hug the couple, tears in her eyes. "I'm so happy for you two." David approached James, extending his hand, but when James went to take it, David surprised him by pulling him in for a hug. "Welcome to the family, son," he said quietly. That night, as the family celebrated the engagement, James realized that he had found something much more valuable than any material wealth. He had found the acceptance, love, and family he had always longed for. As he looked at Sophia, radiant with happiness, and at his future in-laws who had forgiven and accepted him, James knew that this was just the beginning of a new life. A life based on honesty, humility, and true love. The path hadn't been easy, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead, but with Sophia by his side and the support of his new family, James felt ready to face anything the future might hold. As the night progressed and the stars shone in the sky, James reflected on his journey. It had begun with a deception born of fear, but it had ended with a truth born of love. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most to him, James knew that he had finally found his place in the world,